Imagine a crime scene, cold, baffling. The police, they've exhausted every lead. The family is just desperate, and the media buzz has faded. Then maybe there's a whisper. What if someone could see what happened? What if there was another way to find the truth? That enduring human desire for answers, for closure when facing the unknown, well, it's fueled one of the most fascinating and, let's be honest, contentious topics where belief, science, and justice collide. Okay, so let's unpack this. Today we're plunging into a deep dive on psychic phenomena and extrasensory perception, ESP, specifically as it connects to the really high-stakes world of true crime. You've brought us this fascinating stack of sources, articles, research papers, historical accounts that really shed light on this complex landscape. Our mission here is to cut through the noise, to examine the claims, some of which are really compelling, and to understand why these ideas hold such a persistent grip on us. We'll pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight, trying to help you get genuinely well-informed, fast.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here isn't just the question of, do these abilities exist, but actually how this whole topic forces us to ask these really fundamental questions about how we know what we know. It's really an exploration of human cognition, the strict demands of the scientific method, and crucially the role of critical thinking when we're facing just an overload of information, especially in these really emotionally charged situations like a true crime investigation. It's not simply about proving or disproving, It's about understanding the societal impact of belief itself.
That's a really crucial distinction. So join us as we take this journey. We'll go from the formal beginnings of psychical research, think Stokie Victorian parlors, and those first attempts at scientific controls. Then through the Cold War era, government inquiries into, mind-bending powers, all the way to the modern ethical dilemmas, raised by social media psychics today. We'll explore the very human, psychological reasons these ideas stick around, and ultimately, what the evidence really shows. It's going to be, I think, an illuminating ride into the depths of human belief and scientific inquiry. Okay, so to really get where we are today, we need to go back. Way back. Late 19th, early 20th century, this was a time, and it's maybe hard for us to fully grasp now, where the lines between conventional science and this booming spiritualist movement were just incredibly blurry. You had huge scientific discoveries happening, right? But also these profound existential questions, especially after massive losses like the American Civil War, World War I. People were desperately seeking connection with loved ones who'd passed.
And it was in this unique environment that formal psychical research really started to emerge. Organizations like the Society for Psychical Research, the SPR in London, and similar groups in the U.S. These weren't just, gatherings of hopeful believers wanting to talk to spirits. No, these groups included really eminent scientists, philosophers, even future Nobel laureates. They were seriously trying to apply scientific methods, maybe early, developing methods to things like seances, trance mediums, and this idea of thought transference, which we probably call telepathy now. They genuinely wanted to document these alleged events with some kind of rigor to see if there was something real, something measurable behind all the claims.
Exactly. And this early approach is so important because it set up this dual tradition that you still see today. On one hand, yes, these researchers were documenting and investigating phenomena, carefully recording what mediums said, what witnesses reported. But crucially, on the other hand, they were simultaneously inventing and using some of the very first scientific controls designed to try and ensure objectivity. We're talking about things like blinds, where people involved don't know key information, decoys to mislead or distract, marked targets to prevent cheating, stuff like that. And just as importantly, they weren't all believers. They were actively trying to unmask frauds. They understood that deception could easily look like the real thing. So this constant tension, right, between wanting to believe and the demands of skepticism, this push for verifiable evidence, it set a huge precedent for all the investigations that came later. It really highlights a basic challenge. How do you study something that seems to defy normal scientific measurement and is, frankly, so easy to fake with clever tricks? The very act of investigating pushed them to develop protocols that became, staples of scientific work later on.
It's pretty wild to think about that mix of hope and skepticism right from the start. So moving forward a bit, the mid-20th century, the Cold War, how did that intense paranoia suddenly make governments interested in stuff like ESP and psychokinesis or PK? It seems like such a leap.
Well, it was a leap, but you have to understand the context. The Cold War wasn't just about bombs and spies in the traditional sense. It was this all-encompassing struggle for supremacy, technological, strategic, psychological. So governments, particularly in the US, started thinking, well, what if there are other ways to get an edge? They were already looking into hypnosis, sensory deception, psychological warfare. The fear became, what if the Soviets are exploring this mental stuff? Can we afford not to? Could the mind itself be like a secret weapon? Yeah. Could people develop ESP or PK, psychokinesis, the idea of mind over matter? That became a focus. Not just, bending spoons dramatically, but initially the serious talk was about micro PK. Like, could someone subtly influence a random number generator? Or maybe affect some sensitive electronic equipment just with their thoughts? These were the kinds of questions being asked in scientific and intelligence circles, really driven by those intense national security fears. It speaks volumes about that human desire for any advantage in conflict, even exploring things way outside the mainstream science of the time.
And that desire for an edge, that government interest, it led directly to one of the most famous, maybe infamous programs in this whole field. The U.S. intelligence funding of remote viewing experiments at SRI, a Stanford Research Institute, starting in the 70s. The concept itself sounds like science fiction, right?
Yeah.
Can you imagine describing a distant location, maybe a hidden military base somewhere, just using your mind, no maps, no photos, just perception?
It was a revolutionary idea, absolutely. And think about the potential intelligence applications if it worked. Huge. So this program, starting at SRI, it evolved over time, eventually becoming the CIA and DA's Project Stargate. The goal was straightforward. Could trained remote viewers gather useful intelligence on foreign targets? Could they describe things they couldn't possibly see? But here's the crucial part, the part often glossed over in, pop culture versions of the story. The 1995 external evaluation. The CIA commissioned the American Institutes for Research, AR, to review the whole program. And their conclusion, pretty blunt actually, it stated the program did not yield actionable intelligence. Nothing useful for spies or the military came out of it, basically.
Okay. So despite all the effort.
Right. Now, there was that famous disagreement inside the evaluation team. You had the statistician, Jessica Utz, who looked at the lab data and said, hey, I see these small but statistically significant effects. Maybe there's something here, some psi effect. But on the other side, you had the psychologist, Ray Hyman, who meticulously argued that those small effects were likely due to methodological flaws, maybe sensory leakage, biases, problems with how the statistics were done.
So classic scientific debate.
Exactly. But the key takeaway for the government, the bottom line, was operational utility. Despite that internal statistical debate, the program was shut down, terminated, because it just wasn't delivering useful, verifiable intelligence in the real world. The practical application just wasn't there.
That lack of practical application is a recurring theme, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now let's shift from government labs to popular culture. Uri Geller. Spoon bending was everywhere in the 70s. He was a huge star. But his appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson in 1973, that became this legendary moment, didn't it? A real touchstone in the whole skepticism versus sci debate. It crystallized things for millions watching.
Oh, absolutely. It's still talked about, and for very good reason. The backstory is key. The famous magician and skeptic James Randi secretly advised the show's producers. His advice was simple. Impose tight controls on the props. Don't let Geller use his own stuff. Provide the spoons, the keys, whatever, and make sure they haven't been tampered with beforehand. Randi knew the methods, you see.
So no pre-bending or preparation.
Precisely. And the result, live on national television. Geller's usually effortless-seeming feats, they just faltered. He tried to bend spoons, tried to make things move, and nothing much happened under those controlled conditions. It really drove home the question, what happens when extraordinary claims face extraordinary scrutiny? That Carson appearance became this classic, very public demonstration of how proper controls, especially controls designed by someone who understands deception, can expose trickery. Or at the very least show that the claimed phenomenon doesn't manifest when those opportunities for trickery are removed. It was a powerful lesson for the public, like pulling back the curtain right there on TV.
It really sounds like Randi knew exactly what to look for. And he didn't stop there, did he? He took that lesson about fooling researchers and applied it in this really audacious experiment called Project Alpha from 79 to 83. He actually secretly planted 2 young magicians, skilled conjurers, into a university lab that was studying psychic abilities. They posed as real psychics. It sounds ethically complex, maybe, but revealing.
Oh, it was definitely ethically debated, but the outcome was incredibly revealing, yes. For quite a while, these two young magicians successfully produced psychic results that completely fooled the researchers at the lab. The scientists who genuinely believed they were witnessing real PK abilities, wrote papers, presented their findings. They were convinced. However, as Randi, kind of advising from the outside without revealing the plot yet, suggested tightening the experimental controls, making things more rigorous, guess what happened?
The psychic results vanished.
Completely collapsed. The magicians couldn't perform their tricks under the tighter conditions. Project Alpha became this just enduring lesson about experimenter bias. It showed how easily even well-meaning scientists, if they lack expertise in magic and deception, can be fooled. It fundamentally shifted how people thought about designing experiments for these kinds of claims. It highlighted the absolute need for what you might call magician-grade controls. Understanding deception became critical. And that insight, that need to understand deception, it echoes today in fields like forensic science, fraud detection. It's a reminder that rigorous investigation sometimes requires knowing how people can be fooled.
While some were focused on exposing deception, others were still trying to find those really subtle effects. Let's bring in another long-running effort. Princeton University's PEAR Lab, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab. For nearly 30 years, right? From 1979 to 2007, they were deep into studying these tiny deviations from chance in random event generators, or REGs. Looking for that micro PK again, those super subtle mind over matter effects. Like, could thinking at a random number generator make it slightly less random?
That was the core idea. And the deviations they reported finding were indeed tiny. We're talking fractions of a % away from what pure chance would predict. And because they were so small, the findings were predictably hotly contested in the wider scientific community. The main debate really centered on this crucial difference between statistical significance and practical significance. Okay, so maybe after millions of trials, you find a result that's statistically unlikely to be pure chance. But the effect itself is so incredibly small. Does it actually mean anything in the real world? Or could it be just an artifact of the statistics, or maybe some subtle environmental factor influencing the machines, especially given the massive number of trials?
So even if real, maybe too small to matter.
That was the critics' argument. The PEAR Lab eventually closed in 2007. They left behind this huge, meticulous archive of data, but also this ongoing, vigorous debate about how to interpret their controversial findings. The whole PEAR effort became this major object lesson in the scientific community about that vital distinction. Statistical significance doesn't automatically equal real-world importance or practical utility. Just because something is statistically weird doesn't mean it's useful or even necessarily paranormal.
That really highlights the challenge when effects are so small, right? It's hard to be sure what you're seeing. Now, if micro PK was about mind influencing machines, what about mind influencing mind? Telepathy. That brings us to the Ganzfeld experiments, which had a kind of renaissance in parapsychology in the 1990s. The setup sounds interesting, mild sensory homogenization, like putting someone in a quiet room, ping pong ball halves over their eyes for diffuse light, white noise, and headphones, creating a kind of mental blank slate.
Exactly. The idea was to reduce the normal sensory input, the noise, hoping to make the mind more receptive to a potential telepathic signal from a sender in another room who was focusing on a randomly chosen target image or video clip. And the claim from parapsychologists using these Ganzfeld protocols was that they were getting above-chance hit rates. Participants were supposedly guessing the target significantly more often than random chance would predict.
Okay, so potentially evidence for telepathy.
Well, that's what some researchers argued. A big moment was a 1994 meta-analysis by Daryl Bem and Charles Honorton. They combined results from many Ganzfeld studies and argued it showed replicable effects, something genuinely anomalous happening. That generated a lot of excitement in the field, but that optimism was quickly challenged. A subsequent, very critical 1999 meta-analysis by Milton and Wiseman disputed the robustness of those findings. They pointed to significant potential problems. One was the file drawer problem, the possibility that studies finding no effect simply weren't published, leading to a biased literature that only showed the positive results.
Like publication bias.
Precisely. They also highlighted potential methodological flaws in some studies, things like subtle sensory leakage. Maybe the participant could hear something unintentionally, or the randomization wasn't perfect. They argued these issues could potentially explain the results without needing to invoke telepathy. This whole Ganzfeld debate, the claims and counterclaims, it was really, in many ways, a precursor to the bigger replication crisis that hit psychology and other sciences later on. It underscored just how vital transparent reporting, rigorous methods, and independent replication really are.
Speaking of Daryl Bem and the replication crisis, let's jump to a more recent, really high-profile case that absolutely rocked the boat in 2011. Social psychologist Daryl Bem's paper, Feeling the Future. This one made major headlines because it claimed experimental evidence for, essentially, precognition, knowing the future. His experiments, published in a top psychology journal, suggested people could somehow respond to future events, like their memory recall could be improved by practice sessions they hadn't even done yet?
Yeah, the paper's impact was huge, partly because it was published in a prestigious peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It immediately triggered methodological reforms and a replication wave across the scientific world. Researchers, both believers and skeptics, felt compelled to try and reproduce Bem's findings. This was seen as a major test case.
And what happened? Could others replicate it?
Largely, no. Subsequent critiques, very rigorous ones, questioned his statistical methods. And crucially, multiple large-scale, multi-lab replication attempts failed to consistently reproduce the effects Bem reported. This widespread failure to replicate made his paper a real landmark in the whole replication crisis discourse. It became a powerful, if controversial, case study demonstrating the challenges of establishing robust scientific findings, especially for extraordinary claims. It really highlighted the critical importance of things like independent replication, transparency in data analysis, pre-registration of studies. Basically, the need for much stronger scientific methods to ensure findings are reliable and not just statistical flukes or artifacts. Bem's work, ironically perhaps, ended up being a catalyst for strengthening scientific rigor in psychology.
Before we wrap up this historical look, let's just quickly touch on a couple of those lesser-known footnotes you mentioned, things that show how these ideas kind of linger, even in official places. You said even the Department of Justice had a handout mentioning psychics. That's surprising.
It is surprising on the surface, but the context is key. It wasn't like an official DOJ endorsement saying, go hire psychics. It was more of a cautionary procedural note. Basically, a practical guide for law enforcement. What do you do if a psychic calls in a tip? How do you handle that information? How do you log it without giving it undue weight compared to, actual evidence? It was about managing unsolicited information, not seeking it out.
Okay, so more administrative than endorsement.
Exactly. And similarly, there's a declassified CIA reading room document that just compiles various anecdotes from law enforcement agencies over the years about instances where they interacted with sensitives. Again, these aren't validated reports of success, they're just collections of stories, some may be involving coincidences. What these documents really reflect is the topic's persistence at the margins. Even with official skepticism being the norm, the idea never completely disappears. There's this quiet, maybe informal curiosity or just a pragmatic need to have a procedure for handling any information that comes in, however unusual its source.
Okay, so we've walked through a century of research, government programs, famous cases, skepticism, a lot of scrutiny. Which brings us to the big question. Why? Why, after all this, do these ideas about psychics and ESP still fascinate us so much? Why do they continue to persuade people, even against the weight of scientific evidence? What makes them so sticky?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And a huge part of the answer lies deep within our own minds, in our core cognitive mechanisms, how our brains are fundamentally wired. Firstly, we humans are exceptional pattern finders. Our survival has depended on it, right? Seeing connections, predicting what comes next. But sometimes our pattern-finding machinery goes into overdrive, and we see patterns and connections where, objectively, none exist. We connect dots that aren't really related.
Like seeing faces in clouds or finding meaning in random coincidences.
Precisely. Secondly, there's confirmation bias. This is huge. We naturally tend to seek out, pay attention to, and interpret information in a way that confirms what we already believe or want to believe. So if you're open to the idea of psychics, you'll likely remember the stories of apparent successes and discount or forget the failures. Your belief shapes what you notice.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Then there's hindsight bias, the I knew it all along effect. After an event happens, or after a psychic makes a vague prediction that later seems to fit something, we tend to overestimate how predictable it was. We convince ourselves the psychic statement was clearly accurate, even if it was super generic at the time. Oh yeah, they said near water and they found the car near the river. We forget they might have also said near trees or on a hill.
Right, retrofitting the prediction.
Exactly. And finally, selective memory. This works hand in hand with confirmation bias. We vividly remember the hits, that one specific detail a psychic mentioned that turned out to be right, and we conveniently forget the countless misses, the vague stuff, the wrong information. This makes the hits feel incredibly profound and significant, while the misses just fade away. It builds this compelling but often totally misleading narrative in our heads. Our own cognitive biases are powerful sculptors of belief, even when we think we're being perfectly rational.
So even without any external trickery, our own brains are kind of setting us up to potentially believe these things.
In many ways, yes. Our brains prioritize making sense of the world, creating coherent stories. Sometimes that means smoothing over inconsistencies or emphasizing data that fits the narrative we prefer.
Now layer onto that the most stressful situations imaginable. Profound grief after losing someone, agonizing uncertainty when a child is missing, the sheer terror and helplessness after a violent crime. These are moments when people are at their absolute most vulnerable.
Absolutely. And in those acute crises, a powerful psychological drive kicks in. Ambiguity, aversion. When faced with extreme uncertainty and distress, people are powerfully motivated to find any information, any potential answer, especially when official channels seem stalled or are providing no comfort. The need for answers, for hope, for just something to cling to can become overwhelming. In that state, the threshold for what someone might consider evidence can drop dramatically.
So a psychic offering a vision, even a vague one.
It can feel like a lifeline. Especially for families caught in the nightmare of a true crime scenario, they're in immense pain, desperate for closure, for any sign, any direction. That profound emotional need can unfortunately override critical thinking and make them receptive to claims from sources like psychics, claims they might otherwise caution.
And the modern media landscape often pours fuel on that fire, doesn't it? We're surrounded by true crime content, TV shows, podcasts, documentaries, and these narratives love a good story. A hero with second sight offers a neat resolution that real, messy investigations rarely provide. It makes for compelling viewing or listening.
It's more than just compelling. It's what sociologists call a social amplification effect. It shapes public perception on a massive scale. Think about traditional media TV shows often dramatize psychic involvement, maybe glossing over the misses or the lack of real impact. And now social media turbocharges this. You get viral TikToks, YouTube channels dedicated to psychic readings on cases. It creates this constant feedback loop. Psychic claims are everywhere, normalized, amplified by algorithms. The line between entertainment, where a psychic might be a fun plot device, and factual investigation gets incredibly blurry for the audience. It ends up influencing public belief and perception in a huge way. It's like an information diet. If you're constantly fed these stories, it becomes harder to question them critically.
It's not just the stories themselves either. You mentioned earlier how even scientific-sounding language, or just the fact that the government once looked into this stuff, can create a kind of false sense of authority.
That's a really sharp point. Terms like double-blind, meta-analysis, or even just mentioning Stanford Research Institute or Project Stargate can act as powerful credibility cues. People hear these words or know a prestigious institution or government agency was involved, and it lends this aura of scientific legitimacy, even if they don't understand the methods or, critically, the final conclusions, like Stargate being shut down for lack of results.
Right, the association itself is powerful.
Exactly. The perception of scientific backing or even just serious consideration by authorities can be a potent signal, even if it's misleading. It's a bit like hearing complex jargon from any expert. The language itself conveys authority, and that perceived authority can unfortunately be misused or misinterpreted, making people more likely to accept the claims being made.
Okay, let's bring this right up to the present day. We are absolutely swimming in true crime content, podcasts, YouTube, Netflix. It's a massive creator economy built around unsolved mysteries, cold cases, the search for justice. We're all consuming it.
And within this huge true crime boom, these intuitive leads, psychic readings, visions, gut feelings presented as evidence have found a really prominent place. They're often used as like dramatic beats in the storytelling. Maybe the narrator talks about how the desperate family turned to a psychic, or the host discusses a supposed vision someone had about the case. It adds intrigue, right? Suspense. It suggests maybe there's an answer just around the corner, especially when the real investigation hits a wall.
It feeds that desire for a breakthrough.
Precisely. It taps right into the audience's desire for a compelling story, for resolution. It fulfills a narrative need that real-world police work, which is often slow and painstaking, rarely satisfies so neatly. But the downside is it can seriously blur the lines between entertainment and factual reporting. Listeners might start thinking these intuitive leads actually have real evidentiary weight when, in almost all documented cases, they simply don't. The entertainment value often ends up overshadowing the lack of scientific rigor.
And it's not just passive entertainment anymore, is it?
Mm-hmm.
The digital age has given rise to what you call platform psychics. People on social media, TikTok, YouTube, who actively insert themselves into ongoing true crime cases, making claims about victims, suspects. This has real-world consequences, serious ones.
It absolutely does. We saw this play out in a really disturbing way with the horrific Idaho murders case. On platforms like TikTok, suddenly you had numerous self-proclaimed psychic sleuths popping up. And they weren't just speculating vaguely, they were publicly accusing real people, often private citizens with zero connection to the crime, naming them as suspects based on their supposed psychic insights.
Oh, wow. That's dangerous.
Incredibly dangerous. These accusations, sometimes reaching millions of viewers, led to immediate real-world fallout. Defamation lawsuits were filed. Police departments had to issue official statements specifically debunking these claims, trying to protect the integrity of their actual investigation from all the noise and misinformation. It really highlights the massive legal and ethical hazards of crowdsourced clairvoyance. It's this new, perilous frontier where unverified claims, amplified by algorithms chasing engagement, can cause immense harm to innocent people, obstruct justice, and just muddy the waters for everyone.
And these aren't just isolated online incidents. They're these high-profile, heartbreaking failures that serve as stark reminders of the very real human cost when these claims go wrong in the public eye.
One of the most tragic and widely cited examples is the case involving the celebrity psychic Sylvia Browne and Amanda Berry's disappearance. Back in 2004, live on the Montel Williams show, Browne told Amanda's mother, Luana Miller, that Amanda was dead. She said she was in water and essentially implied she wouldn't be found alive.
God, that's devastating for a parent to hear.
Absolutely devastating. It reportedly crushed Luana Miller's remaining hope, and she sadly passed away a couple of years later, apparently believing her daughter was gone.
But Amanda wasn't dead.
No. Incredibly, 9 years later, in 2013, Amanda Berry escaped from captivity in Cleveland, where she had been held prisoner by Ariel Castro along with 2 other women. It's just this stark, gut-wrenching cautionary lesson about the profound harm that false information delivered with such certainty can inflict on grieving families. It's not just about being wrong, it's about adding trauma, creating false certainty, diverting emotional energy. It underscores the immense ethical weight and responsibility involved when making these kinds of claims, especially in such high-stakes, emotionally raw situations.
Okay, let's really try to deconstruct some of the biggest myths that have taken root, especially through media portrayals. Maybe the biggest one in true crime is this idea that psychic detectives routinely solve cases, that they're this kind of secret weapon law enforcement turns to when things get tough.
Right. That's the trope, isn't it? The intuitive consultant who swoops in and cracks the case. The reality, though, based on actual investigative reviews and documented cases, is vastly different. Claims of psychics routinely solving cases, well, they seldom withstand careful documentation and independent verification. When skeptical organizations or researchers audit these claims, they find very little, if any, verified impact. Sure, a psychic might offer a vague tip, look near water, check abandoned buildings, things that are common sense or statistically likely places for things to be found. Occasionally, this might coincide with where police were already looking or prompt a recheck.
But not specific, unique information.
Rarely, if ever, is there a documented case where a psychic provided specific, unique, verifiable information unknown to police that directly led to solving the crime, finding the body, or making an arrest. In fact, police departments themselves, in training materials and public statements, often caution families against relying solely on psychic tips because they know from experience they rarely lead to concrete, actionable evidence that holds up. More often, they generate false leads, waste valuable time and resources, and sadly can compound the family's suffering. The media narrative and the operational reality are miles apart.
Okay, another huge myth, tied back to our earlier discussion. Government programs proved ESP. Because programs like Stargate existed, many people assumed they must have worked, that the government validated psychic abilities.
Yeah, the existence of the program itself lends it an air of credibility in some people's minds. But again, the reality of the program's own conclusions contradicts this myth. Remember that final external evaluation of Stargate in 1995 by AIR for the CIA? Its explicit bottom-line finding was no usable intelligence resulted from the program's decades of work.
Despite the internal debate about statistics.
Exactly. While Utz argued for small statistical anomalies in the lab data, possibly indicating bias, and Hyman argued against it, citing flaws, the crucial point for the government sponsor was operational utility. Did it help them spy? Did it locate hostages? Did it predict enemy actions? The answer, according to their own evaluation, was no. The program demonstrably failed to provide practical, actionable intelligence, so it was shuttered. The existence of potential tiny contested lab effects did not translate into a validated functional tool. The government concluded it was a dead end for practical purposes.
And the myth that television proves it live, it looks so real on TV, right? The spoon bends right there. The psychic duplicates are drawing seemingly perfectly. They reveal details only the family would know. It feels like proof.
It looks convincing, absolutely. But stage conditions or studio settings are often ideal environments for misdirection, psychological manipulation, and outright trickery if someone is inclined that way. That Randi Geller's incident is the perfect example. When Randi ensured the props were controlled, secured, not Geller's own, suddenly no marvels appeared. The abilities vanished under scrutiny.
So the conditions matter hugely.
Immensely. What appears to be a live, spontaneous demonstration of psychic power on TV is often, upon closer examination, a carefully managed performance benefiting from editing, camera angles, pre-show information gathering, sometimes called hot reading, or simply techniques of mentalism and illusion. Skilled performers, whether they call themselves psychics or magicians, know how to exploit perception and expectation. Rigorous controls are almost always absent in those televised settings, making them entertainment, not scientific evidence.
So this brings us to a really crucial, maybe overlooked truth that emerged from all this history, the importance of protocols and specifically who helps design them. The magician's insight, you called it.
Yes. The history of psychical research and the work of skeptics demonstrates pretty clearly that controls designed with magician expertise are often the decisive factor in sorting out genuine anomalies from sophisticated trickery. This led to a powerful realization. Collaborating with professional skeptics or illusionists can significantly improve the validity of tests for psychic phenomena. Why? Because magicians know how deception works. They understand misdirection, subconscious cueing, psychological manipulation, all the ways effects can be created through perfectly normal, albeit clever, means. Their expertise is invaluable in designing experiments that effectively block those avenues, ensuring that any observed effect can't easily be attributed to known tricks or subtle biases.
So bringing the experts in deception into the lab.
Exactly. And this insight, interestingly, is now increasingly imported into fields like forensic interviewing, intelligence analysis, and fraud detection. There's a growing recognition that understanding the mechanics of deception is vital for robust investigation in many areas, not just the paranormal. It's a great example of interdisciplinary learning improving rigor.
Let's dig into some of the specific expert opinions and theories that have shaped this debate, especially around those controversial government programs and lab results. Jessica Utz, the statistician involved in the Stargate evaluation, she had a specific take on the data, didn't she? Even if the overall program was deemed not useful.
Yes, her perspective is really important for understanding the nuances here. While she acknowledged the lack of operational success, her argument focused purely on the statistical analysis of the aggregated lab data, particularly from certain remote viewing and Ganzfeld experiments. She consistently argued that these datasets showed small but statistically significant above-chance effects, meaning the results were unlikely to be due to random chance alone. The odds were slightly better than guessing.
But small effects.
Very small, typically. But statistically robust in her view, across multiple experiments when pulled together. So her conclusion wasn't psychics are solving crimes, it was more nuanced. She called for continued research under rigorous controls to figure out what was causing these statistical anomalies. She saw it as a scientific puzzle suggested by the lab data, even if the real-world application hadn't materialized. Her focus was on the statistical signal, however weak, needing further investigation.
And providing the counterpoint to that famous Stargate disagreement was the psychologist Ray Hyman. What was his argument against interpreting those statistical anomalies as evidence of psi-psi?
Ray Hyman represented the strong methodological skeptic viewpoint. He meticulously dissected the same data Utz looked at, but came to very different conclusions about its meaning. He pointed to a whole range of potential alternative explanations that didn't require invoking psychic abilities. Things like subtle methodological artifacts flaws and how the experiments were designed or run. He talked about optional stopping, where researchers might consciously or unconsciously stop collecting data once a result looks significant, inflating the odds of a false positive. He also emphasized the possibility of leakage, unintended sensory cues getting through, maybe the sender whispering too loud, or visual cues, and of course, various cognitive biases influencing both participants and the experimenters.
So lots of potential holes.
Exactly. Hyman stressed the absolute need for independent replication. Could other labs, working entirely separately, get the same results consistently? And he always came back to operational relevance were the effects, even if real, strong enough, and reliable enough to actually be useful. He felt the evidence fell short on both counts. His fundamental stance, really embodying the scientific ideal, was that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And for him, the evidence presented just wasn't extraordinary enough, wasn't robust enough, wasn't free enough from potential flaws to warrant belief in psi.
What about Daryl Bem? We talked about his Feeling the Future paper causing a stir. How does his work fit into this landscape of expert opinion, especially given the replication issues?
Bem's contribution is interesting because while he did present lab evidence, carefully analyzed statistically, purporting to show these retroactive effects precognition, essentially, the ultimate impact of his work was perhaps less about proving psi and more about highlighting issues in scientific practice itself. The widespread ensuing replication failures by other labs, combined with very strong Bayesian critiques questioning the statistical strength of his original findings, turned his paper into a major flashpoint in the replication crisis.
So it became a catalyst for change.
Yes, exactly. His work, though highly controversial and its findings largely uncorroborated by independent labs, inadvertently became this powerful case study. It forced the field of psychology and other sciences to confront the need for much stronger methodological standards. Things like pre-registration, open data, more rigorous statistical approaches to ensure the reliability of published research. So ironically, his attempt to prove something extraordinary ended up strengthening the methods used to evaluate all claims.
And we can't discuss this debate without mentioning the skeptical community, really personified by figures like the late James Randi. Their approach was quite different from academic debate, wasn't it? Much more hands-on.
Very much so. The skeptical community's focus, especially Randi's, was less on theoretical arguments and more on practical demonstration and demanding rigorous proof. Their key contribution was actively demonstrating how conjuring methods mimic claimed abilities. They would replicate supposed psychic feats using magic tricks, showing audiences and scientists how easily they could be fooled. Their core message, relentlessly advocated, was that fundamental principle: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. They effectively shifted the burden of proof squarely onto those making the psychic claims, demanding clear, unambiguous, repeatable demonstrations under tightly controlled conditions often designed with input from magicians to prevent trickery. Randi's famous $1 Million Challenge was the ultimate expression of this. Prove it under controlled conditions, and the prize is yours. No one ever successfully claimed it. Their legacy is this insistence on rigorous, verifiable proof against claims that seem to defy known science.
But despite all that skepticism, some parapsychologists do continue their research, right? They must have some theoretical ideas about how these alleged phenomena might work, even if the effects are small and contested.
Yes, there are researchers within parapsychology who continue to investigate and try to develop theoretical models. They often attempt to propose information-based or quantum-inspired models. These models sometimes draw analogies from quantum physics ideas like entanglement or non-locality, suggesting maybe consciousness interacts with the physical world or information flows in ways not yet captured by mainstream physics. They're trying to find a theoretical hook for the small statistical anomalies they believe they observe in some lab studies like PEAR or Ganzfeld.
Are these models gaining traction?
Well, they remain highly controversial within the broader scientific community. Critics often argue that these are frequently just metaphors, not testable mechanisms. They might sound sophisticated, borrowing language from physics, but they often lack the specific, predictable, falsifiable hypotheses that are the hallmark of robust scientific theories. So there's an ongoing theoretical debate, but for many scientists outside of parapsychology, these models are seen as speculative attempts to explain effects that they aren't convinced are real or robust in the first place. The search for mechanisms continues, but it's hampered by the instability of the phenomena they're trying to explain.
Now, it's really easy for us maybe to get caught up in this Western framework of labs, statistics, skepticism versus belief. But the idea intuitive guidance of some kind of second sight is definitely not confined to just our culture, is it? How do these concepts show up elsewhere, say in South Asia or the Muslim world?
You're absolutely right. It's a global phenomenon, often deeply embedded in cultural and religious contexts. In South Asia and many parts of the Muslim world, belief in intuition, dreams, and jinn, those supernatural beings often believed to inhabit a parallel reality, significantly informs popular narratives in everyday life. It's not just folklore, it shapes how people understand events. While modern police forces operate, it's quite common, often informally, for individuals or communities to consult peers, Sufi spiritual guides, saints, or other healers, especially in times of crisis, like for unexplained illnesses or, yes, unsolved mysteries or crimes.
So it might happen alongside a police investigation.
Often, yes. A family searching for a missing person might seek dream interpretations from a respected elder or visit a shrine for guidance even as they cooperate with the police. It reflects a more integrated approach where different kinds of knowing, spiritual, intuitive, empirical, might all be considered, even if only the empirical evidence is admissible in a formal legal sense. It shows how these beliefs are deeply woven into the cultural fabric.
And what about Latin America? What kinds of traditions do we see there?
Latin America has rich traditions like curanderismo, a complex system of folk healing that often blends indigenous, European, and African beliefs. It frequently involves spiritual consultations, herbal remedies, and ritual practices. Here, curanderos, mediums, or shamans often coexist with official investigations in the public imagination. It's not just a private belief, it permeates popular culture. Think of telenovelas featuring characters with psychic gifts, radio shows where people call in seeking spiritual advice on problems, local legends about healers solving mysteries.
So it's very visible in the culture.
Very visible. It highlights how deeply these practices are integrated into everyday life and popular discourse, reflecting long histories of indigenous spirituality and syncretic religious traditions that offer comfort, guidance, and frameworks for understanding life's challenges, including crime and loss.
Moving across the globe to sub-Saharan Africa, how do these concepts manifest there?
In many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, traditional healers like sangomas or diviners are culturally respected figures. They play vital roles within communities, often consulted for healing, guidance on personal matters, and understanding inexplicable events, which can include crimes or misfortunes. Their methods vary widely, perhaps involving trance, divination with bones or shells, or interpreting visions.
And how does that interact with modern policing?
Well, there's often a disconnect. Modern police forces generally operate under Western legal and investigative frameworks and publicly discourage vigilantism or reliance on occult guidance. However, despite official policy, communities often privately consult sangomas or other diviners, especially when official investigations stall or fail to provide answers. For a family dealing with a crime, visiting a respected diviner might offer emotional solace, a sense of direction, or communal support, even if the information isn't recognized by the formal justice system. It shows that tension between official state structures and deeply rooted cultural practices.
And East Asia. What traditions related to intuition or foresight do we find there?
East Asia has its own diverse array of practices. Think of feng shui, the Chinese art of arranging spaces to harmonize with energy flows for good fortune, or various forms of divination like using temple divination sticks, omikuji in Japan, kaoqim in China, to seek guidance on future prospects or decisions. In these cultures, intuitive guidance and omen readings survive as significant cultural practices, often deeply respected and integrated into personal decision-making for many people, affecting choices about business, relationships, or travel.
But less so in formal investigations.
Generally, yes. While these beliefs are powerful in storytelling influencing films, literature, and personal lives, they are rarely admitted into formal policing or legal proceedings. There tends to be a clearer separation between cultural spiritual beliefs and official state methods. But their prevalence shows a widespread cultural acceptance of non-empirical forms of guidance, even if kept separate from forensics.
Okay, let's bring it back home, so to speak, to Euro-American pop culture. How have these beliefs evolved or been repackaged here to stay relevant over time?
It's been this fascinating, steady pipeline demonstrating incredible adaptability. You can trace a line directly from the Victorian spiritualism craze, with its seances and mediums contacting the dead, through the New Age movement blossoming in the 60s and 70s, which emphasized personal intuition, channeling, psychic development, holistic healing, and right into today's digital world and the algorithmic platforms. Now, rituals and readings are rebranded as content. You have social media influencers offering tarot readings, online psychics doing live sessions, YouTube channels dissecting dreams related to current events.
So the medium changes, but the core appeal remains.
Exactly. It underscores the remarkable ability of these ideas to adapt to new cultural contexts and media formats. They consistently find new ways to package themselves and resonate with audiences seeking answers, guidance, or just entertainment, generation after generation, platform after platform.
Okay, so we've acknowledged the scientific skepticism, the lack of robust evidence, but clearly people do turn to psychics, especially in true crime scenarios. What are the perceived strengths or maybe the psychological benefits that draw people in, even when other avenues seem closed?
From the perspective of the person seeking help, especially in a crisis, the primary perceived benefit is often profound psychological relief. When you're facing the chaos and helplessness of a missing loved one or an unsolved murder, consulting a psychic can offer a desperately needed sense of agency, a feeling that something is being done. It provides hope, comfort, a narrative where there might be none. When all other avenues feel exhausted, even a glimmer of possibility, however unsubstantiated, can be incredibly powerful psychologically.
A sense of control in an uncontrollable situation.
Precisely. And then there's the occasional, though often hard to verify, claim that a psychic's input might inadvertently spark conventional leads. This is tricky. A psychic might say something very general, look near water, check wooded areas. He knew the victim. If police then happen to find something in such a location or focus on acquaintances, it might seem like the psychic was right. But attribution is really murky. Was it genuinely new information or just a lucky guess aligning with common sense or information already available? It's rarely clear-cut, but the perception that it helped can be strong for those involved.
Okay, but let's flip that coin. What are the undeniable weaknesses and serious evidence concerns when we look at psychic claims objectively, especially in the high-stakes context of criminal justice?
The weaknesses are significant from a scientific and evidentiary standpoint. Firstly, as we've discussed, there is the persistent replication instability in labs. Even the small potential effects reported in some parapsychology labs are notoriously difficult for other independent researchers to reliably reproduce. If you can't replicate it consistently, it's not considered a robust scientific phenomenon. Related to this are the tiny effects hovering at statistical thresholds. Even when effects are reported, they are typically so small, just barely distinguishable from chance, that their practical significance is effectively zero. They're not strong enough to be useful.
Which leads
directly to their operational irrelevance. Even researchers who are sympathetic to the possibility of psychology's era generally acknowledge that to date, these phenomena have demonstrated negligible, actionable value for real-world investigations. They don't provide the specific, reliable, verifiable information needed to find a specific missing person, identify a specific killer, or locate specific evidence. The standard of evidence required for science, and certainly for law, is simply not met.
Given all these issues, all the potential harm we discussed, is there any potential benefit to covering these topics in the media, particularly in true crime shows or podcasts? Or does it just inevitably spread misinformation?
I think there can be a benefit, but it hinges entirely on how it's done. If psychic claims are presented solely as dramatic plot points without context, it's problematic. However, when framed carefully and responsibly, these stories can actually serve as powerful narrative devices to introduce broad audiences to crucial concepts in critical thinking and scientific literacy if producers include the science.
So using it as a teaching moment.
Exactly. Producers can use the discussion of a psychic claim as a hook to explain things like what blinding is and why it's important in research, what sensory leakage means, the dangers of p-hacking and manipulating statistics, the difference between Bayesian and frequentist reasoning when evaluating evidence, and the fundamental ethics of evidence, what constitutes proof. By contrasting the unverified psychic claim with the principles of scientific investigation, true crime content can actually equip listeners with valuable critical thinking tools they can apply anywhere. It turns potential misinformation into a lesson in skepticism and methodology.
But the dangers, especially in true crime, remain incredibly real and potentially devastating.
Oh, absolutely. The dangers are acute and cannot be overstated. Firstly, and most importantly, the potential harm to victims' families. Offering false hope that gets cruelly dashed, or delivering false confirmations of death, like in the Amanda Berry case, it adds unimaginable layers of trauma to already grieving people. Secondly, the very real misdirection of police resources. Every hour, every dollar spent chasing down a vague or inaccurate psychic tip is time and money not spent on pursuing leads based on actual forensic evidence, witness statements, or solid detective work. It's a tangible cost to the investigation.
And the risk to innocent people.
Huge. That's the defamation risk. When psychic sleuths publicly accuse individuals, especially online, it can destroy reputations, incite harassment, and lead to serious legal consequences for those falsely implicated. Think back to the Idaho murders example. Innocent lives turned upside down. And finally, there's the straightforward grift risk. Vulnerable, desperate families being charged money for readings that provide absolutely no verified useful information. Investigative reports and even official law enforcement training materials warn about this repeatedly. It's preying on people at their lowest point, adding financial injury to emotional devastation.
So after this entire journey exploring the history, the science, the psychology, the cultural variations, the dangers, why does this topic of psychics and true crime still resonate so deeply? Why does it still matter so much? What does it ultimately tell us about ourselves?
I think it persists because it sits right at this intense intersection of fundamental human hope, our built-in cognitive biases, the power of media spectacle, and the painstaking process of scientific methodology. It forces us again and again to confront that core question: how do we know when we know? The whole story of ESP and investigations, when you look at it historically, is really the story of the slow, often difficult development of better controls. From the SPR's early attempts to the shielded rooms at SRI, to Randi's insistence on magician-proof protocols, to today's calls for pre-registration and replication, the consistent lesson is that rigorous methodology designed to rule out error and deception is our only reliable path to knowledge we can actually trust. This whole debate acts as a mirror, reflecting our deep yearning for certainty, our blind spots, and our capacity for scientific self-correction. It matters because it's about how we build reliable knowledge itself.
So looking ahead, what's the path forward? How can we apply these lessons both within scientific research and in how media covers these topics? What should we be pushing for?
In science, particularly when studying controversial or anomalous claims, the key is advocating for method reform as culture change. This isn't just about one lab doing things better, it's about changing the norms. That means things like making pre-registration standard practice, stating your hypothesis and analysis plan before you collect data. It means encouraging adversarial collaboration, where researchers with opposing views, maybe even including skilled magicians or skeptics, worked together to design the strongest possible tests. It means prioritizing multi-lab replications to ensure findings aren't just a fluke in one specific setting, and using appropriate statistical tools like proper Bayesian modeling, which is often better suited for evaluating evidence for extraordinary claims. It's about embedding rigor into the culture of science itself.
And what about the media side? The creators, the platforms?
There, the focus needs to be on platform governance and responsible creation. Media producers, podcasters, YouTubers, TikTok creators, they need to adhere to ethical best practices, maybe like YouTube safe guidelines, but specifically for true crime. That means absolutely no unverified accusations against private individuals, clear disclosures when content is speculative or entertainment versus factual reporting, clear sourcing for all claims, and adopting trauma-informed storytelling that prioritizes the dignity and safety of victims and their families above sensationalism. Ultimately, the goal for both science and media should be enhancing public literacy, using these fascinating, if controversial topics to teach how to think about controls, evidence, bias, base rates, rather than just telling people what to believe. It's a massive opportunity to empower you, the listener, with critical thinking skills for navigating all information.
Okay, so let's boil this down. For you, the listener, engaging with true crime content, or maybe even creating it, what are the practical, actionable takeaways from everything we've discussed? Things you can actually use.
All right, number one, absolutely crucial. Label clearly and protect the innocent. If you encounter or discuss a psychic lead, always recognize and label it for what it is. Unverified, speculative information, not fact. And never, ever identify private individuals as potential suspects based on such claims without solid, credible sourced evidence. The potential for harm, legal and personal, is just too high.
Remember Amanda Berry's mother. The human cost has to be front and center.
Exactly. Which leads to number two. Center the families and victims. Always advocate for and choose content that avoids sensationalizing or dramatizing visions that contradict known facts or offer false hope. Prioritize victim safety, privacy, dignity, and consent in any discussion. The narrative should serve justice and healing, not just clicks or ratings built on potential re-traumatization.
Don't just accept the dramatic story. Look beneath the surface. Ask about the context.
Right. Number three, elevate the method and demand the full context. When you hear about ESP research or remote viewing, like Stargate, make sure the full story is there, including the 1995 CIA termination context, the fact it was shut down for lack of results, and the Utzheimen disagreement. Don't settle for just the exciting claims. Demand the caveats, the critiques, the full scientific picture to really understand the nuances.
And finally, recognizing that even these controversial stories can be learning opportunities.
Yes, absolutely. Number four, use the teachable moments. Understand how the Carson-Randi incident perfectly illustrates the importance of controls against deception. Understand how the Ben episode, despite its controversy, became a catalyst for crucial replication reforms in science. Recognize why this commitment to rigorous methodology, to empirical, verifiable, reproducible evidence matters so profoundly, not just in science labs, but in evaluating everyday claims, news reports, and especially in the pursuit of justice. #outro.
Wow. We have covered a lot of ground today. From those early psychical researchers in Victorian England trying to apply scientific methods, through Cold War governments chasing psychic spies, right up to the ethical minefields of TikTok sleuths today. We've explored the deep psychological reasons these ideas grip us and look hard at what the actual evidence shows, or perhaps doesn't show.
And throughout that entire history, that core tension persists, doesn't it? Whether you happen to believe there are tiny, unexplained statistical anomalies in some lab data, or you believe it's all down to flaws and biases, the ethical bottom line, especially when real lives are affected, has to be crystal clear. In the high-stakes world of real victims, real suspects, real investigations, the evidence we rely on must be empirical, it must be independently reproducible, and it must be operationally useful. Anything less with terrible consequences. The scientific method, with all its flaws but also its capacity for self-correction, remains our best tool for getting closer to reliable knowledge.
The mysteries of the human mind, consciousness itself, they're absolutely worthy of continued exploration and study. Our capacity for belief, for hope, for finding patterns, it's fundamental to who we are. But when it comes to justice, when liberty and lives hang in the balance, our methods have to be rigorously grounded. We need approaches that provide real, verifiable answers, capable of withstanding scrutiny, not just compelling narratives. It really comes down to how we choose to build our knowledge, and critically, who we prioritize protecting in that pursuit. So, as always, we encourage you to keep asking that question. How do we know what we know? Apply that critical lens, that demand for evidence, to the information you encounter every day. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.